Cyan, the creators of Obduction, Myst and Riven, recently brought their new puzzle adventure game to Mac, Firmament. Today we're going to have a look at how it's been made for Apple Silicon machines and its performance across 7 different Apple Silicon Mac models. Pause the video now for a list of supported Macs for Firmament. Firmament has been in development for some time. In fact, I've been talking about it on this channel since 2019. From the get-go, Mac has always been one of the game's target platforms. This is no surprise, as Cyan have always been known to port over their groundbreaking puzzle games to our platform. The game uses a customized version of Unreal Engine 4.27+. It's also one of the first Mac games to support Unreal's new MetaHuman framework. MetaHuman gives developers the ability to create highly realistic human characters ready for animation and motion capture. Cyan told me there are no graphical settings missing from the Mac version over other platforms too. You have the same post-processing effects, HDR, and AMD FSR 1.0 support. AMD FSR 1.0 features 4 modes. I would have loved Cyan to try out Metal effects with this game, as it doesn't even require Metal 3, it's only limited to macOS Ventura. For whatever reason, they have gone with AMD FSR 1.0. I'm not complaining, I'm just stating what they've done. Just like the 2021 remake of Myst, Firmament supports the Metal 2.1 API and is completely native on Apple Silicon-based Macs, running under the ARM64 architecture. It's a universal app, so it has an x86 64 build for Intel Macs as well. Now let's have a look at the game's performance across a range of Apple Silicon-based Macs. To showcase average frame rates on Mac, I have tested the game across 5 common locations in the game. First, let's start with Apple M1. Pause the video now for the specs of my M1 based Macs. Let's see how the game plays at 1920 by 1080, medium settings with VSync disabled and no FPS limit. Or you can see the exact settings on screen now. Even at this state, the game is unplayable, averaging 20.6 FPS on my 13-inch MacBook Pro and 21.6 FPS on my M1 iMac. The only time it gets close to 30 FPS is inside the Swan, with about 28 FPS. One thing I noted is that the game often takes up over 10 GB of memory. I thought this might be a reason for the poor performance on M1 Macs with only 8 GB of RAM. However, unlike my MacBook Pro, which has 8 GB of RAM, my iMac has 16 GB of RAM and sees practically the same frame rate at this state 1080p medium. So what if you want closer to 30 FPS on M1 Macs? It's possible with my on-screen recommended settings now. You'll be playing at 1600 by 900 resolution. VSync on, a 30 FPS target is enabled, and mostly high settings, with shadows and textures on medium. AMD FSR is switched to quality. The game is running at quite a low resolution, but it's the best I could get this game to run here, with mostly high settings and a stable-ish 30 FPS. High settings are very important for this game to appreciate the very good quality graphics in Firmament. On my 13-inch MacBook Pro, we're seeing 27.2 FPS, and on my M1 iMac, 28.4 FPS on average. What if you want a higher FPS, like 60. That is possible here. See my on-screen settings now. This is 1600 by 900 resolution again, with a 60 FPS limit, VSync on, and mostly medium settings with view distance and shadows on low. AMD FSR is switched to performance. In this state, my 13-inch MacBook Pro sees 52 FPS, and my M1 iMac 54.6 FPS on average. The game goes below 60 FPS in some locations, for example, Gilleston. This is the best I could do to get up to 60 FPS on these machines. The internal resolution is stupidly low here, which makes reading text difficult. And the game looks super blurry. It's up to you if you want to play the game this way. Overall, I don't recommend playing this game on M1 Max because it's not in an acceptable state. I'm not really holding out hope that the performance will improve with patches. Maybe a little bit, I don't know. It's just this game is quite big for M1 now. These chips are starting to show their age, unfortunately. Up next is Apple M2. Pause the video now for the specs of my M2 based Macs. Let's see how the game plays at 1920 by 1080, medium settings with VSync disabled and no FPS limit. Or you can see the exact settings on screen now. There are obviously still some scenes where the FPS will go quite a bit below 30, but it's nowhere near as bad as M1. In fact, the game is considerably more playable here than M1, with about plus 8 FPS in most of these locations at the same settings. Even though the game takes up over 10GB of RAM often, it doesn't really change the performance on both my machines, whether if one has 8GB or 16GB, it doesn't really matter. On my M2 13-inch MacBook Pro, the game sees 30.6 FPS, and my M2 Mac Mini 31.9 FPS on average. If you want to play at higher settings, but don't mind 30 FPS, you can use my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 1920 by 1080 resolution, but with a 30 FPS target, VSync is on, and mostly high settings, with shadows on medium. AMD FSR is switched to quality. On my M2 13-inch MacBook Pro, the FPS is 28.6, and on my M2 Mac Mini, 28.6. A locked 30 FPS is just not really possible at reasonably high settings, unfortunately. But with these settings, the frame pacing should be much better, and really it's all possible thanks to AMD FSR. This is absolutely my preferred way to play the game on these machines, and a 30 FPS cap is completely playable for this game, in my opinion. If you want 60 FPS on M2 Max, it's possible using my on-screen recommended settings now. This is again 1920 by 1080 resolution, a 60 FPS target, VSync is on, and mostly medium settings with shadows on low. AMD FSR is switched to performance. On my M2 machines, the average FPS is 57. I still don't recommend trying for 60 FPS on M2, as to reach this type of performance, you have to play at a very low input resolution, and the game doesn't look great. For example, reading text can be difficult. Overall, M2 performance is much more enjoyable than that of M1. If you have one of these devices, you can be happy knowing it's mostly playable here, with some fairly high modifications to settings though. Moving on, we have M1 Pro. Pause the video now for the specs of my M1 Pro Mac. Let's see how the game plays at 1920 by 1080, medium settings with VSync disabled and no FPS limit. Or you can see the exact settings on screen now. my M1 Pro 14-inch MacBook Pro sees 40.8 FPS on average. It obviously performs better than M2 and especially M1, but I was expecting it to be somewhat closer to 60 FPS in this state. It often goes as low as 30 FPS in many scenes, and in some rare cases, into the low 20s, which is not ideal. With some configurations though, you can play at higher settings, but you'll have to accept 30 FPS. Use my on-screen recommended settings now for this. This is 2560 by 1440 with VSync enabled, a 30 FPS cap, and a mix of epic and high settings. AMD FSR is switched to quality, so I'd say the game actually looks quite nice in this state, especially with higher video settings enabled. The average FPS on my machine is 28. If you want 60 FPS on M1 Pro, this is possible using my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 1920 by 1080, VSync is enabled, a 60 FPS cap is on, and a mix of mostly high and medium settings with shadows on low. AMD FSR is on balanced here. The average FPS on my machine in this state is 58. Unlike M1 and M2, these 60 FPS settings are a little bit more enjoyable in M1 Pro, as the game doesn't look nearly as blurry and text is easier to read. Overall, the performance on this M1 Pro device is okay. That being said, I was expecting it to be at least quite a bit more powerful than the M2 chip's performance. I mean, it is more powerful, but I wanted it to be even more. Now it's time for M1 Max. Pause the video now for the specs of my M1 Max machine. Let's see how the game plays at 1920 by 1080 resolution, medium settings with VSync disabled and no FPS limit. Or you can see the exact settings on screen now. On my 16-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro, it sees about 77.5 FPS on average. Look, it's hard to calculate the average FPS on this device as it's anywhere from 60 to 120, so I'm really just, in many cases, just completely guessing, but anyway, performance here is excellent, but it's a shame you need such an expensive Mac to play this game well. The game still has biggish performance issues in some scenes, but it's nowhere near as bad as those weaker chips. If you want to push this device to its limits, you can kind of play at near 4K resolution using my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 3360 by 1890. VSync is on, a 30 FPS target, and a mix of epic and high settings. AMD FSR is on quality. The average FPS on my machine in this state is 29 FPS. It does drop to about 25 FPS on the odd occasion. Sadly, playing at 4K resolution just wasn't ideal on this machine, as it goes well below 30 FPS too frequently. If you want 60 FPS at a reasonably high resolution and settings, you can use my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 2560 by 1440 with VSync on, a 60 FPS limit, and a mix of epic and high settings. AMD FSR is on balanced here. The average FPS is 57. For me, this is my preferred way to play the game on M1 Max. A decent FPS and good enough video settings to enjoy the next-gen visuals are on offer to you. I mean, who else would there be on offer to? What if you want more than 60 FPS on M1 Max, like, I don't know, 120? Let me introduce you to my on-screen recommended settings for 120 FPS gameplay. This is 1920 by 1080 resolution. VSync is off, the FPS target is 120, and mostly medium settings with shadows on low. AMD FSR is switched to performance. On my machine, in this state, the average FPS is 114.6 FPS. Look, entirely up to you if you want to play the game in this state. It doesn't look outstanding, but if you have a high refresh rate display, you might appreciate the high frame rate more than the visuals. Overall, the gameplay is quite well here, which is to be expected. I would have liked it to be able to play at 4K more comfortably, but that is where M2 Max comes into play. Our last device to look at in my possession is M2 Max. Pause the video now for the specs of my M2 Max device. Let's see how the game plays at 1920 by 1080, medium settings with VSync disabled and no FPS limit. Or you can see the exact settings on screen now. On my M2 Max 16-inch MacBook Pro, it sees 90 FPS on average. I'll say once more, it's hard to calculate the average FPS on this device, as it's anywhere from 60 to over 120 FPS at any given moment. Obviously, good performance is going on here, but you can definitely go well above this. This device is kind of capable of 4K using my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 3840 by 2160 resolution. VSync is enabled. FPS limit is set to 30 and most settings are on epic, but shadows are on high. AMD FSR is on quality. The average FPS is 30 for me. This clearly isn't native 4K, but the game still looks pretty wonderful in this state. If you have a 4K display, definitely give this a go. 60 FPS at high resolution and settings is easy here. Using my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 2560 by 1440 resolution. VSync is on, a 60 FPS cap, and most settings are on epic except for shadows, which are on high. AMD FSR is on quality. For me, the average FPS here is 58. The performance also doesn't take as big of a hit during those challenging scenes either. What if you want more than 60 FPS on this chip too, like 120? Let me introduce you to my on-screen recommended settings for 120 FPS gameplay. This is 1920 by 1080 resolution, VSync is off, the FPS target is 120, and all settings are on medium. AMD FSR being on performance means the resolution is upscaled from 960 by 540. On my machine, in this state, the average FPS is 114.2. Again, up to you if you want to play the game in this state. I wouldn't, it doesn't look amazing, but if you have a high refresh rate display, you might appreciate the high frame rate more than the visuals here. Up to you, buddy. The game really shines on M2 Max, but this should be no surprise, it's a freaking powerful chip. Almost all of you watching won't have a Mac with an M2 Max chip though, or M1 Max for that matter. So it's annoying that such expensive devices are the best way to play this game well, in my opinion. So, what do you think of the Mac port of Firmament? Are you impressed or disappointed by the performance? Will you get this game on your Mac, or have you already bought it? If so, how is it performing for you? Let me know in the comments. For me, this port is not amazing. It's not really playable on pure M1 and only sees passable performance on pure M2. This is very disappointing, as these are the most common Macs that you guys will have on you. Anyway, leave a like if you found this video useful and subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date with new native Mac game reviews. My name's Stewie, and thanks for watching.